Howdy. Good evening. I'm John Sherman, class of 92. I am Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service, and it is my honor to welcome you here for a special event tonight. This is part of the ConocoPhillips White House Lecture Series, sponsored by the Mosbacher Institute. And I want to thank ConocoPhillips for sponsoring this very important lecture series. Momentarily, my friend and colleague Alice Yates is going to do a formal introduction, but we are so honored tonight to have Ambassador John Negroponte, an expert in so many fields, and tonight he's going to be talking about the economic policies of George H.W. Bush, the namesake of our wonderful school right here in the Bush School of Government and Public Service. And Ambassador Negroponte was my boss when he was Director of National Intelligence, and a tough customer he was there, as we're bringing him intelligence to support President George W. Bush and that administration. He knew the questions to ask on so many areas. We have so many wonderful people here tonight. There's a few special guests I would like to recognize. Tonight we have another one of my bosses, former White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of Transportation, Andy Card, and his wonderful wife, Reverend Kathleen Card. Let's give him a big round of applause. We have the former president of Texas A&M University, Dr. Bowen Lofton. We have John and Daisy White with us tonight. Somebody I was just talking to and I'm so grateful for his service. We have the Mayor of College Station, Mr. John Nichols. We have members of the Bush School Advisory Board. We have Dr. John Adams, class of 73. One of my personal heroes, Lieutenant General Randy House and his wonderful wife, Jeannie. And last, but certainly not least, the chair of the Bush School Advisory Board, Mr. Neil Bush. So it is my honor now to turn the mic over to Alice Yates, who is the CEO of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation and the wonderful partner we have in everything we do here on the Bush Complex. Let's give Alice a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Sherman, for that nice introduction. He and I get to do this fairly often, so we're getting this down. I told him if I could memorize everyone's bios, I wouldn't even need a notebook, but the extraordinary work of our guests is too long for me to memorize and too important for me to forget something. So what a privilege it is to be part of the team here at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Center, and specifically at the George and Barbara Bush Foundation. Our opportunity to take donors' ideas and commitment to philanthropy and create inspiring programs is really a privilege. And tonight is no exception. Of course, we believe in our mind there's no greater example of leadership, loyalty, and selfless service than our 41st president. But that being said, this ConocoPhillips White House Lecture Series is meant to find exceptional leaders who embody that same spirit and let them tell their stories, let them inspire the next generation of leaders in public service. So the program will begin with remarks from an exceptional leader whose distinguished career has shaped American diplomacy and national security. And then following that will be a moderated conversation. I'll spend more time introducing that guest, but let me start by introducing our moderator, Dr. Raymond Robertson. Dr. Robertson is the director of the Mosbacher Institute, the academic program director of the Bush School in Washington, D.C., professor in the Department of International Affairs, and holder of the Helen and Roy Rue Chair in Economics and Government at the Bush School. Raymond's a dear friend, a mentor to students, and a true, I've heard him described this way before, student's professor. Joining us tonight, one of his co-professors, so Ambassador Negroponte and Dr. Robertson teach a class together at the Bush School, D.C., is Ambassador John Negroponte. Ambassador Negroponte currently serves as vice chairman of McLarty Associates, which he joined in 2009 after a remarkable career in public service. He represented the United States as ambassador to Honduras, Mexico, the Philippines, the United Nations, and Iraq. In Washington, he held several senior posts, including National Security Council staff twice, as director for Vietnam and then deputy national security advisor, the first director of national intelligence under President George W. Bush, deputy secretary of state, where he served as the State Department's chief operating officer. In the private sector, Ambassador Negroponte served as executive vice president of the McGraw-Hill Companies and chairman of the French-American Foundation. He's shared his experience and insights as a lecturer at Yale, Georgetown, the University of Virginia, George Washington University, and as I mentioned, with our own students at the Bush School, DC. Today, he continues his service as Chairman Emeritus of the Council of the Americas, America Society, and co-chairman of the U.S. Philippine Society. He's received numerous honors, including the State Department's Distinguished Service Medal twice, and the National Security Medal, awarded by President George W. Bush. He told me earlier that he doesn't know how to retire, so he's done several roles. Personally, I'm honored by his service to our George and Barbara Bush Foundation Board of Trustees, and we got to spend some time together last week and really value his opinions and his service. So please join me in a very warm welcome to Ambassador John Negroponte, our ConocoPhillips White House Lecture Series speaker.
Thank you very much, Alice. And as I said earlier, I don't think I've spoken to such an impressive collection of people in quite a while. So thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity. I thought maybe what I'd talk about first a little bit is my relationship with Bush 41, with George Herbert Walker Bush, how that came about, and then a little bit about what he stands for in the history of not only American diplomacy, but American politics and policy generally, and then maybe a bit on the question of economic relations with the hemisphere and how, in particular, the NAFTA came about, because I just happened to be in a couple of key meetings when the Bush 41 administration gave birth to that institution. I think I can honestly say that George Herbert Walker Bush and I went back a long way. And that's for the following reason. Fairly simple. Bucky Bush, his youngest brother, was my classmate at Yale. And he was a big guy, those of you who knew Bucky. And in fact, he went to Greenwich Country Day School before he went to Yale. Oh, and he went to Hotchkiss also. But I mean, he was at Greenwich Country Day at one point. And our school in New York City, a private school called Buckley, used to play football against Greenwich Country Day every year. And we were all scared to death every time we had to go up to Greenwich to play against Greenwich Country Day, because Bucky Bush was one of the linebackers. He was in the defense somewhere, and he sort of, if he'd wanted to, I think he could have ripped us all apart. He was a very, very big and strong man and a wonderful person. And he was also, I think, the first or second man in our class at Yale to get married. And I think it was in between his sophomore and junior year, something like that. And I went to his wedding, which was in Greenwich, Connecticut, from which time I date the fact that I met his older brother, although I can't really remember whether I met his brother at that time or not, but he was certainly there. My next important encounter with George Herbert Walker Bush was when we met at an airport going to Maine. We were in Boston, and I asked him, Diana, my wife was with me, we asked him what he was doing, and he said, I'm going to declare, this is whatever the first year was that he announced that he was going to run for president. He said, I'm going to announce that I'm running for president. And then the next more substantive encounter was when I was the director for Vietnam on the National Security Council for Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and Mr. Bush was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, and Dr. Kissinger asked me to brief Mr. Bush on the recently concluded, we had just finished negotiating the peace agreement. I use the word advisedly, the so-called peace agreement between ourselves and Vietnam, and he wanted me to brief the chairman of the, this is a cell phone violation. I'm going to turn it off. Sorry about that. There we go. I hope it's off. If it's my daughter, so if she pipes up in this conversation, don't be surprised. So I briefed on the Vietnam agreement, but then he became vice president, and I saw him quite often, most notably when I was stationed as ambassador to Honduras, and Mr. Bush played a special role in nurturing our relationships with those countries in that beleaguered region. And he came to Honduras 3 or 4 times, and I've never seen anybody enjoy his visits so much, because every time he came, the president of Honduras lined up these children leading to his own village, and they had flowers out, and it was a complete Central American, cheerful, festive party scene. And President Bush just enjoyed visits like that so much. I think he got a feel. He said, gosh, John, I'm really getting a bit of a feel of what Honduran politics are like. And there were very active politics in Honduras at that time. So those were the early substantive days. Then I ended up at the National Security Council as Colin Powell's deputy, and we interacted every day. He attended President Reagan's daily intelligence, we didn't do an intelligence briefing. It was a national security briefing, but it included intelligence as well. And he was always there until the campaign of 1988 began in earnest, and then he couldn't always attend. But he'd call in from the campaign. Whenever he ran into a foreign policy question, he wanted to be sure that he'd answered it well, or he wanted to know what my thought was on X, Y, or Z. I mean, stuff would come at me from out of left field from Mr. Bush, but it was always a pleasure to work with him. And I just thought that, and this would be really my second point, I just thought that he was the exemplary, truly exemplary public official. I can't think of anybody I've met in my life who had not only the credentials, because he did have the credentials, nobody questions that, but it isn't that, it's the experience and the humanity to carry out his role and his position in the humane way that he did. And it was just absolutely a wonderful thing to behold, especially if there were sometimes when there were malicious stories circulating around or whatever controversy happened, as you all know, exists constantly in the city of Washington. But he handled all that like a real prince. And I admired him enormously for that. And then he ran for president successfully in '88. He becomes president-elect. He says to me that I'd like to keep you in Washington if you're willing to stay. And I explained, look, I'm a Foreign Service officer. My whole career, my whole life has been going out to the fields, coming back for a few years, then going back out again. And frankly, I'm ready to go out again. And I'd like to go to Mexico. I told him what I wanted to do. And I think he'd already indicated to somebody else that they might get the job. But when Colin Powell supported this idea, he thought twice about it, and he said, well, you have to go over and talk to Jimmy Baker about that. And of course, Mr. Baker was Secretary of State elect or designate, and they offered me the job. And Mr. Bush said at the time, I want to send a message to the career Foreign Service of the United States. And I sort of got to thinking about what he might mean by that. Well, I learned very quickly. A few days later, he announced that he would send Tom Pickering as ambassador to the United Nations, a career officer, Raymond Seitz to London, also a career Foreign Service officer as ambassador, Mike Armacost to Tokyo, a career Foreign Service officer, and myself to to Mexico. So he really did send a message to us that he had developed such a close, and I would say confident, relationship with the Foreign Service of the United States and the professionalism of our service that he was very comfortable naming us to these positions. And just in the context, when you think about it, of what's going on today and the way the State Department is being treated, I think you can understand why we all felt a great sense of pride in the confidence that our president had in his career service. So that was a wonderful thing. During his presidency, and this is kind of interesting, I looked in the various biographies that have been written about him and other writings about the U.S. economic relationship with Mexico. You know, you can hardly find a word. You can hardly find the word Mexico mentioned. And yet, here's this group led by a president with a Secretary of State who's from Texas, with a Secretary of Commerce who is from Texas, and others, all of whom just naturally, intuitively understand the value of a healthy economic and political relationship with the country of Mexico. They just got it. It wasn't, you didn't have to spend a lot of time explaining it to them. And before he took office, but after he'd been elected, like in November of I've got to remind myself of when this was, probably 1988, he had a meeting in Houston, Texas with President-elect. This was one of those times in the cycle every 12 years where the President of Mexico and the President of the United States both get elected in the same year, and they had a great meeting together and talked about the future, and it talked about the possibility of strengthening economic relationships, and they called it the spirit of Houston. Everybody was running around talking about the spirit of Houston, but they really he understood the importance of getting the relationship off to a good start. And frankly, in all honesty, he was picking up on something that Ronald Reagan had also done. Mr. Reagan understood the importance of Mexico. He understood. He had a kind of slightly different way of looking at it. He said, they're neighbors, aren't they? One time, Mr. Reagan either called on or invited the mayor of Washington, D.C., sort of a controversial figure, I think, a bit of a reprobate, if I remember. But they asked Mr. Reagan, well, why did you invite him to the White House? And he said, well, he's my neighbor, isn't he? Just a good, straightforward idea. I think that appealed to a lot of people. Well, that ultimately led to the things that it led to. And in March or so of 1990, I'd now been nominated and gone down to Mexico as ambassador in June of '89, and in early 1990, the president of Mexico called me in, Carlos Salinas, or his chief of staff did, rather, and said, we understand you're going to Washington, but would you please raise with President Bush and Secretary Baker, and I met with them together, the idea of exploring a free trade agreement between us. And I got the meeting, and I have a picture of it, just four of us. Mr. Reagan, Mr. Bush, Mr. Baker, no Reagan, Mr. Bush, Mr. Baker, one National Security Council staffer, and myself, four of us. And we talked for about 45, 50 minutes. I think I did most of the talking. Mr. Baker did quite a bit of it too. And at the very end, he just looked at us and said, okay. So that's a pretty clear-cut instruction. And so we went forward, and a couple of years later, we completed the negotiation and signed the agreement in San Antonio at sort of the end of '92, just after the president had lost the election to Mr. Clinton. And unfortunately, it didn't go into effect right away, because when the Democrats came in, Mr. Clinton and his trade people wanted to add a sort of environmental and labor protocols to the agreement. But we got through it anyway, and they asked me to stay in Mexico as ambassador until we finally completed the negotiation of those two sets of protocols in late August, I think it was, early September of 1993. So that's when the deal was finally cemented. I think notwithstanding what people will say today, or some people will say, I think this was an agreement of historic proportions. I think it brought the economic relations it was responsible for bringing the economic relationships between our two countries to new heights. And we're now well over $800 billion in two-way trade between the two countries, which is an almost miraculous number, and I think we'll reach a trillion dollars at some point in the not too distant future. And I think that Mr. Bush would have every right, and did have every right, to be very proud of what we accomplished in improving that relationship, and by including Canada in it, the concept of a North American economy, the roots of that concept were planted with the NAFTA, and I think that too was a very good thing. So we can talk about it perhaps a bit more with Raymond when we delve into this a bit farther. But it was, and I've read an article by Henry Kissinger where he argued that probably this was one of the most strategic accomplishments of our foreign policy in the 20th century. So, you know, it was not a trivial accomplishment. I think the last thing I'd like to say up here at the podium, and then maybe we can continue our discussion in our exchange, Raymond and I, is that to reiterate what I said at the beginning, it's hard to find a man who is so qualified to occupy the positions that he did. And it's almost like each job he had, it just built and prepared him for the next step of the way. And nothing short of wonderful accomplishments in the field of public service. And the other thing, and it's one can't overestimate the talents and the experience and the decency that this man brought to the high public offices that he occupied. So I, for one, just feel so privileged to have ever been able to work with this gentleman. I guess it's somewhat got to do with the roll of the dice, right? You just happen, your assignment just takes you to certain places, and you have the good fortune of meeting someone like George Herbert Walker Bush. But I, for one, am just ever grateful that I had that opportunity. And I guess I would have to conclude by just saying I just love the guy. Sir.
Thank you.
Yes.
That was really amazing. It really touched, I think, so many of our hearts in so many ways, the people who really knew George Herbert Bush, and to hear you, remind us of all those amazing qualities, even though we keep them in our hearts every day, is really amazing. I want to thank you so much for that. That was really amazing.
Thank you.
I got to tell you, nobody ever asks me, why do you like that job you have? Because I get to work with this guy and attend these kind of meetings and be part of this community. It's been such an amazing opportunity for me in my life, and I just want to thank you and this entire community for making me feel so at home. And this has just been the best job I've ever had in the world. And having this opportunity to talk with you tonight, I want to thank you so much for being here.
Well.
If I could just kind of build on some of the things you said, just to kind of get started. I mean, one of the things that you pointed out was that you felt really honored when the president made those appointments to you to Mexico and a number of the others because they were recognizing the value of the career Foreign Service officer. But you didn't really tell us why you got into the Foreign Service to begin with. Like, what was the reason why you got called? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I started my career, believe it or not, in October of 1960. So it's 65 years ago this month that I joined the Foreign Service. I had passed the exam. You take a written and an oral exam, and they said, "Well, when are you prepared to come into the service?" I said, "Well, as soon as you can." First of all, when I'm 21, because I wasn't 21 yet. I was just shy of 3 weeks of my 21st birthday. You had to be 21 to come in to be an officer of the United States. So I said, yeah, I'm ready. But I'd been accepted at Harvard Law School because they told me that it might take a while to get in because of the clearance process and the health exams, and the McCarthy era had just passed, and they were slow rolling the entrance process, so that sometimes it took as long as a year or something like that. So I went to Harvard Law School. I bought all those heavy books. I rented a small apartment. And a week after getting there, I got a telegram from the State Department saying, "You're hereby invited to join the entering class of the Foreign Service, the forthcoming class, which will convene in October of this year, October of 1960, that is." So I told the dean, "Yeah, I want to do that." And he said, "Yeah, and you've come in time to get your tuition back." So that wasn't a bad deal either. Although tuitions weren't then what they are today, alas. So I started then, but the influence on me to want to be a diplomat was really my father. He was Greek, but part of the diaspora. He was born in Switzerland. He was Francophone. He spoke French. And he also went to the School of Political Science in Paris. Some of the students here that I spoke to today know about that school. Sciences Po, it's called for short in French. It's the Institut d'études politiques, the Institute of Political Studies. And he had gone there, and he went to the Greek embassy in Paris or Switzerland, I don't know which one, and said he wanted to join the Foreign Service. And they said, well, if you want to do that, young man, you've got to go back to Greece and go through college all over again in Greek, and then come back and apply. And he said, well, he didn't want to join that badly. Go do his 4-year degree all over again. So I think, in a way, vicariously, he influenced my career. My parents talked about foreign affairs and international things all the time when I was growing up in New York. The war, everything, anything to do with international relations. What was happening in Europe, which they knew and understood extremely well. And I think he gave me great encouragement to want to be a diplomat. I never sort of worried about some of the minor practicalities about the pay may not be as good as it would be at some brokerage house in New York, or whether it would be that easy to cart your family around the world, which Foreign Service officers do, just like Army officers do, and which can be sometimes quite a challenging aspect of a Foreign Service life. I think one book was called Pay, Pack, and Follow. He influenced me. I'd say that probably more than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And he was not a Republican. So that when Mr. Nixon came around, and I was working in the Nixon White House, and I was really quite happy. I enjoyed my job. That gave him a certain amount of pain, and was a source of some discomfort between the two of us. But we got over it.
So, but sometimes it's one thing to be inspired by your parents and hear these stories of how great it would be to be in the Foreign Service. And another thing that once you're in it, you realize, aha, like this is for me. Did you have like an aha moment where you realized that this has definitely been the right choice, that this is what I wanted to do?
I think so. It was Vietnam. I came back from my first assignment, which was Hong Kong, 1961 to 63, and I came back to a so-so job in the department. It was not very interesting. And I got called up by the personnel division one day in August of 63, saying, look, things are hotting up in Vietnam, and we're trying to recruit more people to study Vietnamese to prepare them for jobs in the embassy in Vietnam. So I accepted that, and I went to Saigon 8 or 10 months later. May of 64 I arrived. It happens to have been Buddha's birthday. I always remember that because there was no one there to meet me at the airport. It was a holiday. And so that was the reason why. But I think once I got into that job, and my first job in the embassy, which was reporting on developments in 7 South Vietnamese provinces. I'd go out every week. I'd do reports on the political, military, economic situation in that particular province. I'd come back. We didn't have the internet and everything else. Come back for a week, do my laundry, write my report of that provincial visit, and then the following week go back out to another province again. And I did that for 18 months. I did that. And then I re-upped for another tour in Vietnam. And I think my Vietnam experience, that initial assignment to Vietnam, really consolidated my interest. I said, yeah, you know what? This is pretty interesting stuff. And then I also noticed who all came out to visit us. when I was at the embassy. And it was all of Washington, and it was all the luminaries in the press corps, and where else are you going to meet? Cy Sulzberger and whoever else comes up. Robert McNamara. I mean, we sat down. He wanted to meet with junior officers from the military and the embassy and AID, and we sat. When he came out, there was a big dinner for 150, 200 people, but McNamara asked for a table with junior officers. And so I was one of the officers who was at his table of 8 or 10 people, and we got our licks in about what was going on in the country. I'm not saying we told him the right stuff, but that was the kind of experience it was. It was actually kind of, it was pretty high level, and it was stimulating. It was very stimulating. And we had at least one presidential visit. We had Lyndon Johnson came out at least once. Hubert Humphrey came out. Hubert Humphrey, this is too silly, but I'm going to say it anyway. They took him out to the countryside to show him some of the rural development work we were doing, and they took him to a Vietnamese farm. And the next thing you know, Humphrey is down on his knees looking into a pig cage and doing hog calls. And at the height of his voice, whatever, I'm not going to try to imitate a hog call. And then the guy from public radio or something, in the background you can hear him, "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard the Vice President of the United States." So, we had interesting experiences. Oh, and Henry Kissinger came out. That's the segue.
Yep.
Henry Cabot Lodge, the ambassador, when he was ambassador, we had several ambassadors, but Lodge was there twice during my time. And he invited Professor Kissinger to come to consult for him and do a trip around Vietnam and then write a report. And our boss, who ran the political section, and he was the one managing Kissinger's trip, assigned me to take Kissinger around. Somebody told me earlier that they were in the First Corps area. Well, they told me to take him up to First Corps, to Hue and other places. And so I got to know Henry that year. And then the next year, 65, he visits again, and he goes through the whole same routine again. And I took him again through First Corps and also up into the highlands, up to Kontum and Pleiku. And my biggest impression of Henry, which he would never, in recent times, admit to, was that he was scared to death of flying. He was absolutely terrified. And we'd fly in these small Air America. They belonged to the CIA. They were King Airs. They were, Beechcrafts. And I have images still in my mind of Henry hanging onto the curtain in the airplane. Or he'd go, before getting into the plane, he'd say to the pilot, he'd say, "Captain, good morning. Do these planes really fly over those mountains?" That was the beginning of my relationship with Henry.
How could you not love your career at that point?
That was interesting stuff. Yeah.
Just to shift gears a little bit, I mean, when I think of your career, I'm just blown away because it seems to me like whenever something was going on in the world, you were there. And I wanted to shift a little bit towards Latin America because you spent a lot of time there.
I did.
So what, when you shifted from Vietnam or whatever and you moved towards Latin America, what was your first impression? Like what was your sense of how Latin America was unique?
Well, first let me say, I really had a double major in my foreign service career. I mean, I majored in East Asia and Latin America. I had a few assignments outside both of those areas, but those were my main assignments. In Asia, it was Hong Kong, Vietnam, and the Philippines, right? I ended up as ambassador to the Philippines. And in Latin America, which I really enjoyed, was Ecuador as a political officer at the embassy, Honduras as ambassador, and Mexico. So those were the experiences in those countries. What did I think about Latin America? Well, first of all, I was excited to go. I had to have a change from Vietnam. So when they sent me to Ecuador, that's where I went after working on the NSC for Henry. I just welcomed the change and the relief from the pressure. I mean, the White House is a pressure cooker. Don't let anybody tell you anything otherwise. It is a pressure cooker under whichever administration. I don't know how Mr. Card looks so well, but it's true. It's tough work. It's very tough work. So I was glad to be out of that, and I got a chance to breathe a little bit. I think my initial attraction to Latin America, honestly, was cultural. It was the language, wanting to know the language, and I was fascinated learning it, and now it's probably my best foreign language, so I care about that. I loved, when I was younger, Latin music of all kinds, and I guess a Latin American girlfriend helped at senior year at Yale, so that was also part of it. But in terms of the substance, it's a region just fraught with our history and the history of the relationship. And let's face it, after all, in the 19th century, our relations with Latin America were, in large measure, I'm not saying completely, but in large measure, were the foreign policy of the United States, right? Even George Herbert Walker Bush called me up from the campaign one time and said, "Hey, John, do we still believe in the Monroe Doctrine?" I remember he asked me that. Because he got in an argument with somebody on the campaign trail. And actually, it's not an easy question to answer, because I don't know whether we pay much lip service to the Monroe Doctrine in any way, shape, or form. I don't know. You might know.
A little bit.
Yeah.
But you must have come across a lot of colorful leaders.
Well, yes. I mean, starting with, I didn't come across him, but Fidel Castro certainly ranks amongst the more colorful. And I remember the 1960 visit that he made to New York, and that was a tumultuous UN General Assembly that year, and it just happens to be the year that I entered the service. So, he was impressive. Other leaders that ended up knowing about during the course of my time in Latin America, whether it was Carlos Salinas of Mexico, or others. I mean, how can you not like? I mean, I served in Ecuador, which has always been both a bit of a political and economic mess, and I think that may still be the case. How can you not like a president, Velasco Ibarra of Ecuador, who said, "Give me a balcony and I can win an election"? I mean, how can you describe populism better than that?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what he did. He would get a balcony, he'd speak, he'd get elected, and then the military would immediately throw him out. It must have happened about 3 times.
Yeah,
You remember Velasco?
Yes, of course,
you
of
may
course.
not.
I teach it in my Latin American class.
Yeah.
Students,
Yeah.
But you did notice, you did mention in your remarks that when you were given the option about where to go and the president asked you, you said Mexico in particular, but you didn't say why. I mean, why was it you wanted to be assigned to Mexico at that time?
Well, first of all, I had quite a bit. We haven't talked about it because it's not entirely germane to this landlocked location here, but at one point I was the chief marine fisheries negotiator of the United States. I was the deputy assistant secretary of state for oceans and fisheries. With the rank of ambassador, it was actually my first ambassadorship. And NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, had the lead, but my office had the lead on fisheries policy, but I had the lead on the negotiations.
Mhm.
Now, I forgot what the original question was. Oh, Mexico. Well,
Yeah,
a
why you
lot
picked
of the work I did was with Jorge Castañeda Sr.,
Yep.
the father of the recent foreign minister. Well,
Yep.
I knew Jorge Sr., who's no longer alive, and he was their Law of the Sea negotiator. He'd been a foreign minister, and he became foreign minister again. And we had this huge battle with Mexico and all the eastern tropical Pacific countries about the regulation of eastern tropical tuna, yellowfin tuna. And it was very, every specialty managed to make issues complicated, right? Well, it was very complicated. We had a very complicated law, which didn't recognize coastal state jurisdiction of highly migratory tuna because they were why? Because they were highly migratory and they didn't spawn within the 200-mile zone. They spawned out in the middle of the Pacific. So naturally, the coastal state doesn't have jurisdiction, right? Because it served our interest to fish in
Right.
those zones, and we didn't want to recognize. So we had a law that actually financed conflict with these coastal states. It was called the Fishermen's Protective Act. It had a very nice sounding name. Well, what it was every time an American tuna clipper with tuna caught in these countries' coastal zones was found and had to have been caught, the U.S. government compensated the tuna fishermen, the American tuna fishermen, for the value of the fishery catch that was found on board and confiscated from them by the coastal state in an enforcement action. Well, soon we found that there was more tuna really occurring in our own coastal zone. And in order to, set things straight, we ended up ultimately recognizing coastal state jurisdiction over tuna. But for about 30 years, we had this conflict with these countries that was fueled entirely by the U.S. budget.
Wow.
Yeah, in case you want to know where some of your taxpayer dollars were going at that time.
Wow.
But anyway, that got me to dealing with the Mexicans a lot. Andres Rosenthal, Castañeda, et cetera. And with the foreign ministers and the ministers of Costa Rica, et cetera. Venezuela even, and Panama,
Yeah.
all of them.
Right.
The fisheries, if Vietnam was kind of a career-forming experience, I'd say in terms of honing negotiating skills, I think being chief fisheries negotiator was really the best job.
Wow.
And I learned about every different species of marine fish, because they all have different biological cycles. I mean, the tuna does not behave the same way as salmon, which does not behave the same way as herring, so that you actually have to know something about the biology of each of these fish to negotiate agreements about how to protect them and share catches and so on and so forth.
Wow.
This was fun. It was very
That's
interesting.
amazing. I have to say, you said that a lot of it's luck about when you get assigned, but you chose to go to Mexico at one of the most historic moments in Mexican history, right? There was a lot going on at that time with the change in the economy and everything else. I mean, what was Mexico like at the time when you started there?
Well, Well, it was starting to modernize, okay?
Exactly.
And it had this import substitution model during the post-World War II period. There was this fellow from South America somewhere, Prebisch, right?
Yep, Raúl Prebisch, yep.
Raúl Prebisch, who
Yep.
was the apostle
Yes.
of import substitution. And actually, the import substitution model worked quite well for Mexico up to a certain point. So
Yes.
that they had a period of strong growth, actually, in the 1950s.
Mhm.
But the model started to peter out. This is really what happened. And so we had to find a new way. And the Mexicans found it themselves. What happened was they had a terrible economic crisis in '81. And they had a devaluation of huge proportions. And then Miguel de la Madrid, who's the first president that Reagan knew, decided for Mexico to join the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that's when the thinking really started to change in Mexico. He brought them into the GATT. And then you had this group of new economists, PhDs, all from Princeton, Harvard, MIT, you name it, Chicago, who were advising De La Madrid. And so when Carlos Salinas, who is a PhD in political economy from Harvard, got elected, they implemented this new economic theory and model with a vengeance. They wanted really free trade. They weren't fooling around. I mean, they believed, they were sort of all like Friedman, really, Friedman economists. That's what I think of them as. And they were pushing, as we said a little earlier, they were pushing on an open door here. And Mr. Bush, being the great listener that he was, because you know you're going to say, well, find me evidence that he believed in Friedman-like or free trade back, you know, when he was going to college or something. I don't think you'll necessarily find it. But what you do find is that he was a superb listener. And he'd now listened to these guys talk about their situation enough that he understood what to do. He said, well, this is what they want to do, and I want to be supportive because Mexico is important to the United States. And so the reform process coincides with the advent of Mr. Bush, and that ends up making the marriage.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Would you say that the President Bush's vision for the agreement, I mean, how much of it was diplomacy and how much of it was economics? Like, did you have a sense of how they were thinking about all those things together?
Look, they got it.
There wasn't a lot of discussion.
Why worry
Said
about
okay.
the thought process? Because I think a lot of it was intuitive.
Yeah.
A, intuitive, and B, being supportive of the Mexican side.
Yeah.
And then, the Canadians. So we had the famous meeting. We went to see Mr. Bush, me and Baker, and one guy from the NSC. And then at the end of the conversation, Mr. Baker says, but there's one thing. The Mexicans were assuming it would be a trilateral discussion with Canada in it as well. He says, I don't want to do it. I can't imitate his accent. You know his accent too well. I don't want to negotiate with the Canadians. And you know, we all said, well, why? He said, well, because he didn't have a good experience in negotiating the end. He was the closer in the negotiation of the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement in the end of, I guess it was 88.
Yeah, 88.
Or 87 with the Canadians, because he thought they were just being too fussy and too prissy. I mean, I think he probably was. He'll forgive me for saying that. So he said, no, I won't do it bilaterally. I mean, trilaterally. I'll just do it bilaterally. And so I went back to Mexico and said to the chief of staff of the president, I said, Pepe, they don't want to do it trilaterally. And Pepe was the chief of staff of the president, Salinas. He was a bit surprised by that, you know. I don't think he was disturbed. I mean, he accepted it because whatever, they wanted the agreement with the U.S. They weren't going to upset that apple cart. But then it dawned on our Canadian friends that if we did had two agreements like that, the U.S.-Canada FTA and then a Mexico-U.S. FTA, that we would be in the cockpit and in the driver's seat, and we would be maneuvering these two separate agreements, and the Canadians, and they would have no voice in the sort of trilateral aspect of this. And so then he went to Kennebunkport in August, got an invitation, and by the way, I mean, Washington, certainly under Reagan and Bush, I mean, it's again, they're our neighbors, aren't they? I mean, the fundamental relationship was excellent with Canada, always. And with Mulroney, in particular. I mean, and he was one of the orators. I think he was the final orator at the funeral of George Herbert Walker. A wonderful man. So we went back to the trilateral model at Canadian insistence. And my experience with both Reagan and Bush was that if the Canadians insisted on something, and they always have a laundry list of issues with us, but if they insisted on something, we would always do our level best to, I mean that, to accommodate their concerns.
Yeah.
They're a tremendously close ally.
Yeah, Mexico and Canada, they're not just neighbors.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I know we're getting kind of close to the end of time. I was kind of wondering if you had any closing pieces of advice for the students. You met with students today. You said you really had a great time. Is there anything that you'd like to leave the students especially with in terms of wanting to go into foreign service?
They must be, some of them must be here, right? Yeah.
There's
raise your
a
hand.
couple.
Where
Yeah,
are you?
they're around here.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're shy. See, they're shy. They don't want to raise their hands.
Are we being broadcast to our class also?
I'm hoping, yes. That was the
right.
plan, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how well they can see
Yeah,
it.
because this was our day of our class.
We teach on Wednesday nights, so together at this exact time. So we're hoping our class is actually. We're hoping
I'm
the
sure
class
they
is
are.
watching from DC.
If not, we'll take attendance.
Yeah, they're taking a night off otherwise.
Your question was?
Advice for the students.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, for the ones here, because you can
Yeah,
still talk to the ones
Right.
in DC.
Well, first of all, let me just say, I really enjoyed meeting you. Secondly, I was happily, pleasantly surprised at the amount of interest that you all showed in foreign affairs and foreign service at a time when it's being treated somewhat shabbily, if you will, by the current administration. So I thought that was good. That was a good sign. And maybe it just shows that, you can't scare people away from something that, has merit and deserves to be paid attention to, especially in terms of potential career opportunities if foreign affairs is an area of academic and intellectual and professional interest to you. So that is good. The second thing I'd like to say is that for those of you interested in the Foreign Service, I think language and area expertise are, coins of the realm in the Foreign Service. Now, I know they're beating up on us and all of that, but I'd say that the people, including some of the ones I mentioned earlier who got appointments from Mr. Bush, who do well in our business, very often are people who, in addition to other qualifications and knowledge and experience, have strong language, foreign language, and foreign area expertise. I mean, that's a core competence of the Foreign Service, and you never go wrong cultivating those skills and those talents if you aspire to be in the Foreign Service. So if you're studying Chinese, for example, well, have at it, do it. It's going to be useful to you one way or another in your future careers. At any given moment, it may not look as promising as it might ultimately become. And besides, even if they're adversaries, what's wrong with understanding in some depth your adversaries? It's important also. So not just to have a relationship, but also to understand when you're having difficulties with that relationship. So, yeah. No, I just hope you get more students like that.
Yeah,
Really.
It's so easy to find hope today when you have a chance to work with the Bush School students. They're really amazing.
Really. Well, that's good. That's wonderful.
I do have one big I just never feel like I get enough time with you, to be honest with you. I just enjoy our conversations so much. But I realize I have to respect everyone's time because you have things to do. But I wanted to hope you can all join me in thanking Ambassador Negroponte for this visit. Thank you so much.
I have one confession. I forgot the proverbial howdy.
It's never too late. It's
Well,
never too late.
Tried.
Awesome. Please drive safely, and we hope to see you at our next event. We really appreciate you all coming out tonight. Thank you so
Nice
much.
job. Very good. Very good.
Thank you so
That
much.
was fun.
It was really fun.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know, that was great.